those symbols within the table. And it got to a point where I was kind of creating subcategories of subcategories of subcategories of very specific situations that didn't need to be created. And creating way too many kind of characters for the typeface. And Diana's argument, which is fair, is if other typefaces released today don't have those, sometimes it may be that they need them, but sometimes there's a reason why they haven't included those.
Yeah. And I suppose if a designer wants those features, they can always get in touch.
Yeah, and I think the thing about this is it's not a work in progress when we release. But at the same time, I'm sure there will be things that people might pick up on, and the world is full of geeky, fussy designers that will probably contact and let you know. And I think that's a good thing, actually, really. I don't see it as being an end when it's released.
No, I mean, I think that it's very common, isn't it? Most foundries release multiple versions as they add weights or styles, or Arabic or Cyrillic or
I think what they do generally is they'll bank up a whole load of issues, and then they'll probably release those with an additional weight, as you said, or another more dramatic change.
Okay. You worked obviously on 2 designs in parallel. How did doing one complement the other, or not?
I think the fact that they're so drastically different is a good thing, because if I was working on 2 serif families at the same time, I probably would have ended up making the same changes for both. So it means that the 2 typefaces are naturally very different in terms of what they look like, and so I wouldn't have ended up using those same kind of tricks both. And it's also refreshing as well. It's also refreshing when you're working on one and you reach a bit of a block to then work on the other.
They share a similar. I think maybe it'd be good to get your thoughts on this as well. But they seem to share a similar similarity in that there are conflicting characteristics within each. So most obviously within the sans serif you have the almost right angle joints and then the very round forms as well that give it a kind of hybrid personality. But then obviously within the serif you have those flowing lines which then suddenly change direction and speed. That's an observation, not a question. What's the what was the motivation? Was there a kind of deliberate motivation in doing that, in putting these contrasting features in each?
I think when you want something, when you're working in the typeface, there's a fine balance between creating something that has reoccurrence and harmony, but then you also want it to have its own character to it, and to have some slight unexpectancy to it. And I think maybe that's because I'm working on them both at the same time. That might be the reason why they both have that similarity in that way.
Does that go beyond this idea of vertical
unrest?
Vertical unrest, thank you. To a motivation to actually create an identity or a character that is quite visible for each.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it's creating a character, really.
Okay, cool. There's people who finish work at 4:30 for a drink. You talk about type design. I thought this was really interesting. You talk about type design being a creative outlet that feels less constrained.
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting because I and I'm sure most people would presume it would be the opposite, because you're working in a very reductive fashion with 26 characters, and there are only certain things you can do with them. You can only push them so far, and for them to remain recognisably better forms that we know and that we can read. And that was something we talked about, the postmodern era of emigre type. That was, there were designers pushing that to the extreme there. Which you've clearly not gone to that extent.
Yeah.
So, I guess, it seems like actually you have a very narrow world to exist within as a type designer. So what do you mean when you say that it feels less constrained?
I think, you, as a graphic designer, you're working. I mean, the most obvious difference is, as a graphic designer, you're working for a client. So you're constantly doing things that maybe you're quite passionate about and going really well, and you're really sure that they're going to go for an idea or a logo or mark or pattern or anything like that that you love, and then it ends up being in like an archive folder on the server or something like that in the end. And so sometimes it takes its toll when you're designing. That stuff you're doing isn't being used, and then there is always an outcome which not always, but there are outcomes which end up being a compromise. So you don't lose everything, but you don't necessarily have the whole of everything in a way. And I before I was a designer, I was more of an artist. Well, in the school days, and I kind of miss long projects where you're not held back in some ways, and there's a beauty in constraint as well in design, but I miss projects where you can kind of just do your own thing. And I think what you said about type design being this restrictive thing, the more you work on something, the more you understand this kind of subtleties of something. So although your typical person may look at 3 or 4 typefaces and not see the difference, the more you're looking at something in detail, in real detail, the more you notice, the more you get into the mindset of the person who did that, really, I think. And that's why it's also good, for me anyway, to look at existing typefaces and to really look at them in depth and to see how other people have approached them.
Okay. So I guess what you're saying is the world of type design is a little removed from the demands of a designer-client relationship.
Yeah.
And you're less kind of encumbered by the demands of the client, which sometimes conflict with those of the designer or the vision of the designer. And then actually immersing yourself in the world of type design and, spending all day, every day looking at better forms, and you come to appreciate the differences. Differences which perhaps many designers wouldn't even be attuned to, or not on a conscious level.
And there's even geeky things that aren't to do with the aesthetic of a letter, like there are things to do with how features work, how because as I said, you have to preempt situations that people go through, and to try and stop any ugliness from happening through its use. So even going into the open type features or going into the code and seeing how certain things occur. So, when you have certain letter combinations, what's then replaced to make that more harmonious is quite an interesting thing as well.